The financial sector is no exception to the net zero target trend, with a wide range of climate alliances being created with significant membership within the sector. Among these is the Net Zero Banking Alliance, a group of leading global banks committed to financing ambitious climate action to transition the real economy to net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. Canada's largest 5 banks, RBC, TD Bank, Scotiabank, BMO, and CIBC, also called the Big Five, are all members of this alliance. We found that Canada's largest banks are substantially off track to meet their own net zero targets. This is primarily explained by their lack of science-aligned transition policies, their increased financing of fossil fuel companies and low financing of green companies, and their opposition to climate-related policy. While the Big Five banks have all set policies to reduce the emissions linked to their financing activities, we found these to be severely lacking in ambition to be credibly aligned with net zero by 2050. As a result of these policies, or rather the lack thereof, in 2022, the proportion of fossil fuel companies in the Big Five's financing deal value was almost 3 times that of leading US and European banks. As part of their Net Zero Banking Alliance membership, the banks have emphasized the importance of a public policy framework to guide the transition. Our analysis finds that none of the banks have publicly advocated for ambitious climate-related policy in Canada.
For the committee's benefit, can you illustrate the different ways Canadian banks have chosen to implement their products and their policies?
We've seen some level of integration of climate factors into the bank's disclosure and their top-line processes. However, we're not really seeing this carrying through when it comes to having concrete metrics and transition plans that would credibly align the bank's activities with net zero.
You know, I'm curious when we think about what elected officials and governments can do to get the biggest banks on track. What's the role of climate transition plans, and what steps would we need to take to make sure that those kind of strategies or others are implemented?
Governments can play a critical role in helping to guide the financial sector, and that includes banks to align their financing with net zero and as such facilitate that activity in the real economy. A key part of that is increased transparency and disclosure, defining what sustainable activities are and aren't, and how corporations and the financial sector are aiding to finance that activity.
Can you talk or expand a little bit more about the lobbying that's been taking place, the political advocacy from Canada's biggest banks, and how this behavior might undermine those pledges to net zero?
In general, within the financial sector, we see less direct lobbying by financial institutions. What I mean by that is they are not as much themselves interacting with policy. Rather, they seem to rely on industry associations more and more to do this on their behalf. And the Canadian banks are no exception to this. For example, both the financial and real economy industry associations that I mentioned. So while the banks themselves state that they would support a public policy framework to guide the transition and that this is essential, their lobbying seems to undermine that and blocking and diluting climate policy both in the real economy and when it comes to financial regulation is obviously not aligned with the net zero by 2050 pathway.